Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
As we continue our study in Matthew chapter 24, last Lord's Day, when we were looking at these verses, we got down to verse 11, and we're going to kind of pick up there with the thought or the idea as Jesus speaks concerning the coming destruction of the city of Jerusalem. One of the things that he says there in verse 11, and many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. In 1 John, as we mentioned, the second chapter, verses 18 through 19, John speaks about false prophets, those who he speaks of as being antichrist, plural. Not just one singular. Everybody's all fixated on the Antichrist singular, but John said even at that time there were many Antichrists. The whole book of Jude has to do with the false prophets and teachers that were afflicting the church at that time. John tells us in 1 John 4 to try the spirits. Don't believe every spirit, but try the spirits to see if they are of God. We've looked at many of these. And there are various other writers that speak toward the false prophets, teachers. And Jesus said, this will happen. Now, we have to keep it in context. I keep saying this, but remember when Jesus is saying this, they don't know anything much about the cross. They're still looking for him to establish a worldly kingdom, most of them. He hasn't went through the sufferings, the death, the burial, the resurrection. He hasn't been with them those 40 days and then the 10 days and the church established. We have to put all this back in its original context that Jesus was speaking of. When we read the Scriptures, we say, well, the Scriptures tell us all over the place that they're false prophets. Well, remember, Jesus said those things would happen, and those things would happen leading up to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the rise of false prophets. There would be the apostles and the inspired people of the early days of the church. And of course, the gospel would be preached starting in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And as it went out to the uttermost parts of the earth, there did arise many teaching things that were not correct. And Paul speaks about that in Galatians 1 and various other places about those who were removed from the gospel of Christ to another gospel. And so Jesus says, these are some of the things. The church will start growing. In essence, the discipleship will grow, but then there will be a time that there will be this rise of false prophets, and they will deceive many. And that's what Jude and John and all the other writers, Paul was concerned in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, that much like Eve was deceived by the subtlety of Satan, even so the church, who was the bride of Christ, might also be led away. through that subtlety and that deception that the devil had through, again, false prophets, apostles, deceitful workers, even the devil himself being transformed into an angel of light. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. And we've been reading in chapters 2 and chapter 3, studying in the book of Revelation to the 7 churches of Asia. And we can see the effects that many of those things were already having. We have a church which was lukewarm. We have a church that was told it had lost or left its first love. There were those who were being deceived by false prophets and prophetess. Those who claimed, and the writer speaks of as Jezebel, who was leading many of the saints of God away. And so Jesus is telling them these things are going to happen. Well, in the book of Revelation, it's saying these things shall shortly come to pass. The things that we're talking about will begin. And so it says, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this is the same statement that Jesus makes in Revelation 2:10. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Be faithful unto the end, and again you shall be saved. You will be delivered, whether that's through your death or after the events that will take place that so many people speak of as the Great Tribulation, and we'll talk about that as we go along. And of course, there is some debate over what it talks about here about the end. Some say, well, that's talking about the end of the world. Is it? Or is it talking about the final end of the Jewish age with the destruction of the temple? You know, what end are we looking at? And they were talking about when will these things be? And of course, one of the questions they ask him, and it can be translated 2 different ways, you know, when will these things be? When will be the end of the world or the end of the age? And since there wasn't a Christian age, I mean, again, think about this. When Jesus spoke those words, the end, and when they're talking about the end of the world or the end of the age, they're still right at the end of the Jewish dispensation. When will the Jewish dispensation end? When will it finally come to a close? When will the end be? And they saw that end, the end, as being what Jesus was talking about with the destruction of the temple. Now, he is going to talk about the end of the world later on, and we'll look at that. But he says, then shall the end come. And so in verse 14, it says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. The city of Jerusalem nurtured the church in its early days. It nurtured the church. Many of those who came to the celebration of Pentecost stayed and formed a stronger nucleus of the church which was there. Many of those who had houses and lands, they went and sold those and brought them back and gave them to the apostles. And so the church's main nucleus was there. Even Paul speaks about the apostles when he's writing to the Galatians, saying that, you know, Peter and James and some of those appeared to be pillars in the church there at Jerusalem. And so you can't just have the day of Pentecost and then destroy the city of Jerusalem, can you? because Christianity is intermixed with the Jewish people and the Jewish age. And so there is this overlap where the sacrifice is still continuing and people are still coming to the temple to pray. Some are praying through Jesus, some are praying again through the older ways and holding to that. But when we look at this, many people talk about the end. But the Apostle Paul later on in Colossians, the first chapter, verse 23, speaks of this verse being fulfilled because Paul says that the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. And so that's pushing up into probably the later 50s AD when he speaks about that. And so the church that began there at Jerusalem, meeting and assembling in the temple in Solomon's porch, has moved out into Judea, and it's went into Samaria with the teaching there of Philip, and it's went on into the area of Galilee. A church has been set up there in Antioch that becomes a very central church, sending forth the Apostle Paul, Barnabas, Silas, Mark, and many others on missionary work. And all of that's still future tense. But the Apostle Paul, looking back the other way, says it's been done. Now, that didn't mean that every living, breathing soul on the earth had heard the message. But considering, that for them, the world included places that we would think of today as Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, the areas along the Mediterranean, all of those things, the gospel had been preached, and it was moving on into these other areas. We don't see a lot of it. Well, matter of fact, we don't see any that I'm aware of. But the gospel did go into India, and it went over into Britain, and it went into many different places, to Spain. And so it was continuing to grow. And so Jesus said that the gospel that we are talking about now, the kingdom of heaven, the coming of the kingdom and salvation, that gospel will be preached in all nations. And once that happens, then shall the end come. And so the apostles and the inspired members of the body of Christ and others, we've already, we're aware of the Ethiopian eunuch who Philip taught, and he took the message of the gospel down into Ethiopia and into the continent there of Egypt. And if he was taking the message, there were others also that were taking the message. And so this is what Jesus is talking about. Paul talks about it being fulfilled, and that moves us then to start looking about the end in the sense of the end of the Jewish age. That they've asked him about, when will these things be? When will all of this take place? When will the temple fall? What will be the end of the world? He's going to answer all of that. And so in verse 15, as he continues this process, he says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. In Daniel, there was a prophecy in the 9th chapter, 26, 27, 11, 31, 12, 11, different places. And what Jesus speaks of is the abomination of desolation The Greeks, the first fulfillment of that, in essence, was when the Greeks attempted to bring their idols into the Jewish temple. When the Greeks took over in the intertestament period. That's another place we, again, don't read about because but we do have the Maccabees, and we have some writings, the Apocrypha, that talk about the Maccabees and the war with the Greeks. And the Greeks put things in the temple which defiled it. And that's what Daniel speaks of here about in the holy place, that is in the temple. When you see things that are not, as we would say, kosher. Just like when the Greeks were forcing and trying to bring in idols into the temple there at Jerusalem during their time, the Romans likewise will begin to push the issues of bringing in things that have to do with Rome and Roman worship and the worship of the Caesar and many of those. And Jesus warns them, when you see these things going in to the holy place, to God's temple, when you see those symbols and things being brought in to the temple, and one of those, of course, was the eagle. Rome's legions carried a eagle with outstretched arms, which kind of looks like the eagle on the back of the U.S. dollar. Gee, I don't know where we got that, but the Roman legion, and then the symbol there was of an eagle. And so Jesus said, when you see these implements being brought to the temple and you see issues over introducing them into the holy place, then understand that's your time to get out of Dodge. You're warning about signs and symbols and all these things, and I'm going to tell you, there'll be wars and rumors of war, there'll be fighting, there'll be all that, but the end's not yet come. There'll be false prophets, false teachers, which will rise up, and they will deceive many. Many will follow after them. Because of iniquity being again reintroduced into the church, and we see that at Corinth and other places. Again, the love of many will wax old, but again, the end is not yet. The gospel has to be preached into all of the known world. And once that happens, in the midst of all of these other things that are going on, you will see a push to introduce the things of what we today would know as Rome, Roman implements into that. And then, out of all of this, now we're talking about then. So all these things happened before then. Understand this. Jesus is talking about future. All these things are going to happen then. So all that is back on that side. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. What about Galilee? What about Samaria? What about Greece? What about Italy? So he's not talking about the end of the world, at least not the literal world. He's talking about the end of the Jewish age and things associated with the destruction of Jerusalem. And there was indeed a very violent destruction there in the city of Jerusalem, as we will talk about. I would encourage, I know you'd probably have to go back a ways to find it, but if you go back through the church's messenger, you will find links there to a couple of videos where you can see about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. It will send you to a link on YouTube. You can watch that, or you can just go to YouTube and look up the destruction of the temple AD 70, and it'll bring up all these different historical facts. But because the temple is in Judea, and because Judea was one of the last holdouts of those who surrendered to first Vespasian and then to his son Titus. Titus, again, we'll talk about this some, but there was Nero, and Nero sent Vespasian to what today people call the Battle of Armageddon, the Battle of Megiddo. And he sent Vespasian to start conquering and putting down the conflict between Rome and the Jewish nation. And while he was fighting in the areas of Galilee with his soldiers, Nero died. And there was a vacuum of power in Rome. And Vespasian's soldiers encouraged him to go back and assume the throne of Nero. And so Vespasian, who was doing the bidding of Nero, went back and he did take the throne and became Caesar, the king at that time of Rome. And because he was there in Rome, he had to have somebody who could finish what he had started back in Galilee. And so he sent his son Titus and his men, and they finished what Vespasian started. And the finish of that was in Judea. And as we mentioned, Jesus said, not one stone is going to be left on top of the other. Titus's men were, shall we say, barely manageable, in the sense that even though there were certain things Titus didn't want to happen, he really didn't have the ability to stop it per se, because once they got there and once they started fighting and they were meeting the resistance of the Israelites that were still there in Judea, barricaded in the city of Jerusalem. When all that happened, again, Rome became very militant. As Roman soldiers are, they don't bear the sword in vain. They intend to use it. And so that conflict became even more focused in the area of Judea. Some of Galilee was already a part of some of the concepts and ideas that they had embraced through the Greeks and the Romans. The Galileans in many areas were not so much opposed to the things of Caesar as was some of those more, shall we say, militant Jews who wanted to throw Rome out. And generally they were found there in Judea and in Jerusalem specifically. And so Jesus tells them, when these things start to pass, if as a Christian, and he has no control over those who are not interested in what he has to say, but as Christians, when they see these things begin to take place, when you see these things come to pass, if you're living in Judea, then it's time to leave and flee into the mountains. And so many left and crossed over Jordan and went into what we think of today as Transjordan, over in that area where the country of Jordan is today. Some went into the areas that we think of as Iraq and Iran, which in olden days were seen as Babylon and Assyria. And they scattered in many different places out into the world. And so they, as Christians, they, having been forewarned of all of this, left Judea. And depending on who you listen to, but most generally agree that there were very few, if any, Christians who died in the battle with Titus and his soldiers in the area of Judea, because they had already been forewarned to flee. And that was first spoke of by Jesus, and then he sent and testified to his servant John, signified to his servant John the things which must shortly come to pass, so that when they came to pass, they might know of a certainty that this was taking place. Now, how do we know this is not the end of the world? Well, number one, it's only talking about Judea. Everything Jesus said up to this point says, then let them that are in Judea. We don't live in Judea. So it has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with the end of the literal world. It had to do with the end of the Jewish age and the Jewish world with the temple. The temple's not been rebuilt. Let's look a little further. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Friends, if it's talking about Jesus coming again literally, you ain't going to take nothing with you anyway. It's going to happen in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. You're not going to have time to figure out, what do we need to pack and take with us. Paul says, in a moment, in a twinkling, a blink of an eye, the dead in Christ will rise first. We which are alive and remain shall be called up. So this most certainly can't be talking about the end of the world. But what it is talking about is that when they saw the Romans, again, the city of Jerusalem was a city set on a hill, and people, their front porch, as I think of it, was their rooftop. And people in the evenings and different parts of the day would go up on their roof, and they would sit up there on the roof. And since a lot of the houses were together, your neighbors were right there beside of you, just like the olden days, and you could talk, you could look, you could see out over the city of Jerusalem, down into the valleys from some places. And so Jesus said, if you're on your rooftop, and in essence, you see the Roman soldiers, the Roman garrisons marching toward Jerusalem. When you see these things begin to happen, he says, don't even go down in your home to take things, because the time then is very precious in being able to escape. If you've waited this long, Jesus says, you've almost waited too long, and so you really don't have time to pack up the wagon and do this, do that, because the Romans would surround the city, and once the city was surrounded, you took your life into your own hands trying to escape from the Romans, and their purpose was to come and take over the city, and you're going to get caught in the middle of it. So if you happen to still be in the city when you see these things come, don't come down off your roof to put stuff in your bag and all that. You best be finding a way out of the city. It says, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Now that's a certain sense of urgency. If you're in the field plowing and working at that time, if you're out there harvesting, and of course many of the people as they were working would take off that outer garment because it was hot, and again they would gird up their loins so they could have good movement of their legs. They would again have various other things there. I'm sure some of them brought water, some of them brought this. But Jesus says, if you see this and you're out working in your field, my recommendation to you is you're not going to have as much. You didn't see them like the guy on the housetop. You've let them basically start marching right towards you. And Jesus says, if you see that, don't even go back to pick up your clothes. You've waited almost too long. Flee, run. in the opposite direction and get as far away as you can, as fast as you can. That's what he's saying. Woe to them that are with child. If this is talking about the end of the world and Jesus coming back, what difference does a pregnant woman make? Again, none. It makes none if we're talking about the end of the world. However, if you're living in Jerusalem and you're pregnant and you're in the midst of bringing a child into the world, there's lots of difficulties associated with that, because you're not going to be able to travel as fast as you should. Again, hurrying on an animal can endanger both the child and the woman. And so, again, if you have a child, if you have a young child, and you're nursing a child, taking care of a child, and the Hebrew women it's said they would nurse their children up to 4 years of age. And you have to remember there wasn't Gerber baby food and a lot of other stuff. So, again, they would nurse their children up to the age of 4 as they were eating more solid foods, adult foods. And so, again, if you have a child, you are giving a child, or having a child, giving a child, taking care of a child. In those days, Jesus says, the only thing I can say is woe unto you. It's going to be bad enough for those who waited too long. What are you going to eat? As you're fleeing, where are you going to get your food? Where are you going to get your water? Where are you going to stay at night? And this is why it was better off for them to know and to prepare. And when you see these things begin to take place, don't wait, because that's, you've got some logistics that need to be dealt with, and makes things very difficult. Then he says, but pray ye that your flight be not in the winter. Now it does snow some in the Holy Land, but generally speaking, winter is what they consider to be the rainy season. And so winter is a time where there is much rain. And so if the temperature is down and it's raining and you're fleeing in rainy weather, you risk pneumonia, you risk the loss of body temperature, your clothes are going to get soaked, they're going to get wet, and so you're not going to fare too well if you're in the midst of this kind of situation, huddled up under a tree, under a bush, trying to stay in a cave, whatever you can find. It's not going to be well with you. And it also goes on to say, not only should you pray that it not be winter, but it neither be on the Sabbath day. What does the Sabbath day have again to do with Jesus coming? And the answer is nothing. However, if you're living in Jerusalem, it makes a big difference. During the time of the rebuilding of the wall in the city of Jerusalem, many of the Gentiles, the nations who had been living in the land, on the Sabbath day would come and try to do business with the Israelites. They would try to sell them food. They would try to sell them this, that, or the other. They would try to buy. They'd try to sell. They'd try to barter, trade, whatever it is that they did. And so in Nehemiah 13, verses 19 through 22, those who were instructed to again restore the temple and the things of Jerusalem were outraged, in essence, that the Sabbath was being again ignored and disrespected in trade and business. So an order was made in order to stop this, that on the Sabbath day, the city gates would be barred and bolted, and no one was allowed into the city, and no one was allowed out. And so if you see the Romans gathering around the city of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, what are you going to do? The gates are locked and they're guarded. And again, you don't really have much option other than to climb to the top of the wall and jump off. And that's probably not going to be your best decision either. And when you look at the city of Jerusalem there and you see some of those walls, you understand that jumping off one of those walls was probably not a very good thing. So what's the solution to this is to pay attention to the things that Jesus is saying, and by all means, as you have opportunity. And right now, none of this is happening. Christianity's not here. None of that is there. But when the church is established, and as you see these various things happening, it would be best to move out of Judea as a Christian. Don't stay in Judea. Now that may be where your family home is, and that may be where you've always been, but you have some time. Again, make arrangements to transplant your family, to move your family, to get your loved ones in a different place, because the focus of all of this, as Jesus was asked, the primary focus of all of this is the city of Jerusalem and the temple. So logic says the further you are from Jerusalem and the further you are from the temple, the better off you are in not being in the middle of the mix of all of these things. As we kind of wrap this section up this morning, here's another passage that people get all excited about. So here it is. For then, pay attention. He says then, and he says for then. You see these things happen, then this is going to happen, and then, once it starts, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. The great tribulation. How many people have heard of that? People talk about the great tribulation, and that's usually associated with the rapture and lots of other things. Tribulation has nothing to do with Jesus' return. The Great Tribulation has nothing to do with Jesus' return. And there is evidence within that to show that, because, again, this is talking about those who are in Judea. And in Judea, okay, the logic of that is this is taking place in Judea. Then, in essence, in Judea will be great tribulation that this area has not seen since the beginning of the world, no, nor ever will see again. Now, if, again, you take that into consideration, there were over 6 million Jews who were exterminated in World War II. And I don't believe there was anywhere near that many that died in AD 70. I mean, there were a lot. But the point is, it's not Jewish people at all times, everywhere. There's been more devastating things, even upon the Jewish people. Again, 6 million Jews in World War II, not to mention all the other persecution that they have suffered under the hands of the Catholics and Inquisition and all of that. But this has to do with the city of Jerusalem. This has to do with the area. I mean, Jerusalem is a city that's been conquered before. But previous to this, many of those who ultimately were captured were led away into Babylon. And during the time of Jeremiah, there was some very difficult time, but the majority of the Jewish people had been led over into Babylon. But as I understand it, Titus and his soldiers were not interested in taking names or taking prisoners. That's just one more thing to have to worry about, one more person to have to feed, and we don't need that. So the best thing to do is kill them all. And kill them all, that's what's going to happen. Don't take captives, don't do these things. And of course, if you are killing them all, they ain't going to need all their stuff. So the Roman soldiers were delighted to kill and pillage and plunder and destroy because the spoils were theirs. And this leads to this great tribulation, this difficult time. And Jerusalem has seen troubles before, but this time in AD 70 is a time of trouble with those who dwell in Jerusalem and Judea that will not, again, be repeated for this city in the future.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.